You are standing in the grand hall of the royal palace, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and dying lilies. The marble beneath your boots is cold, colder than you expected for a summer's day. Outside, the bells toll their slow, mournful rhythm, echoing across the city like a heartbeat fading into silence. The king is dead. Only yesterday, you watched his coffin pass through streets lined with black-draped banners. You remember the way people wept, their heads bowed, not just in grief, but in uncertainty. A kingdom without its ruler is like a ship without its helm, and already you can feel the currents shifting. You are here today for another ceremony, not a coronation. Though the new king, the younger brother of the late monarch, was crowned less than 10 days ago. No, today is something far more unexpected. The doors at the far end of the hall swing open. She enters. The queen, no, the queen dowager, dressed in white, her veil shimmering faintly in the candlelight. Her eyes do not meet yours. They are fixed ahead, on the man waiting for her at the altar. It is the new king, her brother-in-law. A murmur ripples through the gathered court. Some glance away, others lean in to whisper behind their gloved hands. Your own breath catches, not because of the union itself, but because you remember the way they looked at each other before the old king's death. A fleeting glance here, a soft smile there, things that seemed harmless at the time. Now, under the vaulted ceilings and painted saints, those memories feel dangerous. The priest clears his throat, his voice carrying through the hall. Do you take this man? Outside, the bells have stopped. Inside, the silence is heavy, so heavy you can hear your own heartbeat. The question is not why this is happening. The question, the one that will haunt you long after this day, is, since when? If you've made it this far, you've already stepped into a world where royal duty collides with forbidden desire. This is not just another story of kings and queens. It is a tale buried in whispers, bound by ancient law, and shadowed by questions no one dared to answer aloud. Here on Echoes of the Past, we uncover the moments history tried to hide, the alliances forged in candlelit chambers, the vows taken not out of love, but necessity, or perhaps both. If you enjoy journeys into the forgotten corners of the past, consider joining this growing community of history seekers. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far this story will travel, because what you're about to hear is not simply about a king who married his brother's widow. It's about the thin, fragile line between power and passion, and how crossing it can change the fate of a kingdom forever. The kingdom was not vast, but it was old, older than the carved stones of its palace walls, older than the dynasties whose blood had worn the crown for centuries. It sat at the crossroads of two great powers, a sliver of land that controlled vital trade routes between the mountains and the sea. Its strength lay not in armies, but in alliances, marriages that bound it to neighbors, treaties sealed with the clink of goblets and the clasp of hands. In such a place, marriage was never just about two people. It was a chess move, sometimes defensive, sometimes deadly. The crown was both a prize and a burden, and those who wore it quickly learned that love, if it existed at all, was the least important reason for a royal wedding. By the late summer of that year, the court was still reeling from the death of the king. He had reigned for over 2 decades, a steady, if not always beloved, hand on the tiller. His marriage to the queen had been a union of necessity. She was the daughter of a powerful ally, her dowry a bridge between kingdoms that might otherwise have been enemies. She fulfilled her role with grace, producing heirs and standing at his side through ceremony after ceremony. But not all alliances are built on affection. Rumors whispered through the palace long before the king's death that the marriage was strained, that the queen's smile rarely reached her eyes. Whether those whispers were true or the invention of idle courtiers, no one could say. Yet those same tongues also noted something else: the quiet, lingering glances exchanged between the queen and the king's younger brother. The younger prince had been a fixture at court since boyhood. Handsome, quick-witted, and less encumbered by the weight of rule, he was popular with both nobles and servants. While his elder brother shouldered the affairs of state, the younger man moved easily among the people, attending feasts, hunting parties, and charitable events. It was there, in those public yet oddly intimate spaces, that he and the Queen's paths crossed again and again. The political climate of the time made the king's sudden death more than a family tragedy. It was a potential crisis. Across the border, rival kingdoms were watching closely, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. Within the court, factions stirred, each with their own vision of who should guide the realm. The line of succession was clear. The younger brother would take the throne. But a king without a queen was a king exposed, vulnerable to manipulation and rumors. It was here that an ancient custom, long out of favor in most of Europe, came into play: the levirate marriage. Rooted in biblical tradition and adapted in various forms by different cultures, it decreed that a man should marry his deceased brother's widow, both to provide for her and to preserve the lineage. In practice, it was rare among Christian monarchies, but in this kingdom, precedent existed, if only faintly. The argument for such a union was simple. It kept the late king's queen within the royal household, preventing her from being wed to a foreign ruler who might claim influence over the realm. It also ensured continuity, an unbroken image of stability for allies and rivals alike. The argument against it was equally clear. It was uncomfortably close to incest in the eyes of many, and in the court of public opinion, morality could be as powerful a weapon as any army. And yet, less than 10 days after the funeral bells fell silent, the new king stood beside his brother's widow, ready to take her as his bride. Some saw it as a brilliant stroke of political survival, a decisive move that would seal the cracks in the realm's fragile unity. Others saw it as a scandal, a betrayal of both tradition and decency. For those who had watched the subtle exchange of glances over the years, it was confirmation of something they had long suspected: that this was not a marriage born of necessity, but of a love or desire that had begun long before the crown changed hands. In the streets, the people murmured. In the palace, the whispers turned into measured, dangerous conversations. The kingdom was on the edge of something, though whether it would be remembered as a triumph or a tragedy, no one yet knew. You remember the days before the bells tolled, the days when the old king still walked the palace corridors, his pace deliberate, his voice calm, his presence like the heavy stone walls themselves, immovable, unshakable. He was a man of order, bound by duty more than affection, and in the eyes of the court, his marriage was a success because it served its purpose. The queen was the embodiment of grace, tall, poised, with a voice as measured as the ticking of the great clock in the council chamber. She fulfilled every obligation expected of her, attending masses, presiding over banquets, smiling at ambassadors. But when she was not required to speak, she withdrew into silence, her gaze often resting somewhere far beyond the gilded walls. The younger prince noticed. At first, their interactions were nothing more than protocol demanded. He would bow, she would incline her head. They would share a few polite words at feasts, their voices lost in the swell of music and laughter. But over time, something shifted. It was not in grand gestures, but in small moments. An extra heartbeat before she looked away, a faint curl at the edge of her lips when he made an unguarded remark. He was everything the king was not. Warm, where his brother was cool. Quick to laugh, where his brother was slow to speak. He carried no crown, no burden of constant judgment, and this made him free in ways the queen could only imagine. When he leaned toward her, during a hunt, to remark on the way sunlight caught the autumn leaves, she smiled. A real smile, rare and unpracticed. Rumors began, as they always do, soft and shapeless, passed from maid to guard to counselor. They were careful, always careful. But court life is a theater, and every player is watched. There were evenings when the king was occupied in council, and the queen, escorted by the younger prince, would walk the gardens in the fading light. There were mornings when their eyes met across the chapel, and something unspoken seemed to pass between them. Neither of them spoke of it, neither dared. Perhaps they told themselves it was harmless, a flicker of kinship, a shared understanding between two people living under the same gilded cage. But deep inside, they knew the truth, that in a court where every alliance was political, every word rehearsed, their moments together were the only ones that felt unscripted. It was a fragile thing, this unspoken thread between them, and like all fragile things in a palace, it could not remain hidden forever. It was a morning heavy with clouds, the kind that turn the palace gardens a muted shade of grey. The air carried a damp chill, unusual for the season, and every sound seemed softened, as if the world itself knew what was coming. The bells began before sunrise. 3 slow strikes, a pause, then 3 more. By the second toll, the corridors were already filling with hurried footsteps and hushed voices. You stood in the outer hall, watching the king's physician emerge from the royal bedchamber, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly around a folded parchment. He did not need to speak. The king was dead. Servants dropped to their knees in the chapel. Guards shifted their spears to a mourning stance. Somewhere in the distance, the great gates opened to admit the black-draped carriage that would carry the news to the cathedral. The queen appeared moments later. She was dressed not yet in mourning black, but in the white silk robe she wore for early prayers. Her face was unreadable. No tears, no trembling, only a stillness so complete it seemed almost unnatural. She passed through the hall without looking at anyone, her veil fluttering slightly in the draught from the open door. Behind her, the younger prince walked with measured steps. His head was bowed, his hands clasped behind his back, but even in that moment of grief, you noticed the way his shoulder brushed hers as they moved together through the archway. The funeral rites began the same day. In the cathedral, candles burned in long rows, their flames bending in the draught of the stone aisles. The air smelled of incense and damp stone. Nobles from every corner of the realm arrived, their black attire trimmed with silver, their voices low. It was during those days of mourning that the first rumors began to sharpen. Some said they saw the prince linger too long at the queen's side, offering his arm as she descended the cathedral steps. Others swore they caught the faintest smile between them when no one else was looking. But grief can blur the lines between propriety and comfort. In the shadow of loss, gestures meant in kindness can take on other meanings. And in a palace where every movement is catalogued, every glance interpreted, the space between truth and suspicion is perilously thin. The king's coffin lay in state for 3 days. On the fourth, it was lowered into the royal crypt. The earth was still damp from a night of rain, and the sound of shovels striking the soil was muffled by the wind. When it was over, the queen and the younger king-to-be walked back to the palace side by side, their footsteps in perfect rhythm. The kingdom was leaderless only for a breath. The coronation was announced before the bells had finished tolling for the dead. And so, within a span of days, the court found itself with both a new king and a question no one dared to ask aloud. 9 days. That was all the time it took for the palace to transform from a house of mourning into a stage for one of the most contentious unions in its history. The mourning banners still hung from the ramparts, their black silk stirring faintly in the summer breeze. The scent of incense from the funeral rites still clung to the chapel walls. Yet now the courtyards were swept, flowers arranged, and servants moved with a different urgency, no longer in hushed grief, but in the flurry of preparation. It began with a proclamation, delivered by the royal herald from the balcony overlooking the great square. His voice rang out across the gathered crowd. By the will of God and the stability of the realm, His Majesty the King shall take as his wife Her Majesty the Dowager Queen. The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat the square was utterly still. Then the murmurs began. In the taverns that evening, speculation burned hotter than the hearth fires. Some claimed it was necessity, an ancient custom revived to preserve the royal line. Others whispered it was something far older than duty, a bond forged in secrecy while the old king still lived. The timeline was too short, they said, the decision too swift for grief to have done its work. Inside the palace, preparations unfolded with military precision. The queen's mourning attire was replaced with ivory silk. The king's black cloak was traded for robes of deep crimson embroidered with gold. The chapel was draped in fresh garlands, though some of the older flowers from the funeral arrangements still lingered in the corners, their petals curled and browning. On the morning of the wedding, the air was bright and heavy with summer heat. The procession moved through the palace corridors, the same corridors where, only days before, courtiers had stood in black and bowed their heads. Now they craned their necks for a better view, their expressions caught between fascination and unease. The queen walked with measured grace, her veil trailing behind her like a thin wisp of cloud. The king waited at the altar, his eyes fixed on her with a look that was neither purely ceremonial nor purely personal. It was something in between, something private that the crowd could only guess at. When their hands met, there was a murmur from the assembly, not loud, but unmistakable. A shared intake of breath, the sound of a room realizing it was watching more than a wedding. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged. Outside, the bells tolled again, clear and bright this time, as if to erase the sound they had made only days earlier. And yet, for all the pomp and blessing, the question persisted in the minds of those who watched. Was this the beginning of a new chapter for the kingdom, or the unveiling of something that had been written long before the old king's death? The wedding feast was lavish, but the air inside the great hall was not warm. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and the music of lutes and viols, there was a tension that could not be masked by wine or song. Nobles lifted their goblets in the customary toast, but their eyes, sharp and measuring, were fixed on the couple at the high table. The foreign ambassadors were the first to act. Some offered congratulations with polite smiles that did not reach their eyes. Others sent discreet messages back to their courts before the dessert course was served. They had come to mourn a king, only to witness a marriage that might shift the balance of alliances across the region. Within the palace council, the reaction was far less restrained. The Lord Chancellor, an austere man who had served both brothers, was said to have confronted the new king in private. "Your Majesty, the people are unsettled. The church will be watching." He did not have to say the rest. The risk of censure from the bishops, perhaps even condemnation from Rome, hung over them like a storm cloud. The king's reply, if any, was not recorded, but what followed spoke louder than words. Within days, the council chamber became a battlefield of subtle maneuvering. Supporters of the union argued its necessity: the queen's dowry, her alliances abroad, the unbroken continuity of the royal image. Opponents whispered of moral decay, of scandal poisoning the legitimacy of the throne. The queen herself remained largely silent in public, her composure unshaken. Yet behind closed doors, servants reported she was never alone, always attended by the king or his most loyal advisers, as though proximity itself might shield her from criticism. Rumors began to take on sharper edges. Some claimed to have seen the king visit her chambers late at night in the months before his brother's death. Others recalled how the old king had seemed withdrawn in his final year, avoiding both court functions and his wife. There were darker whispers still, that the old king's death had been hastened, though no proof was ever found. The church's envoy arrived 2 weeks after the wedding. His presence at court was ceremonial in appearance, but everyone knew he was there to observe, to listen, and to report. A single word from his lips could ignite a fire that would consume the throne. It was in this climate, where every glance, every slip of the tongue could be weaponized, that the new king began to understand the true cost of his choice. The crown was secure on his head, but the foundation beneath it trembled. The court had learned to speak in half-sentences. The corridors echoed with phrases that trailed off just before they reached their sharpest point, as though the walls themselves might repeat them in the wrong ears. And yet, pieces of a picture began to surface. Small, almost inconsequential details, scattered like coins, dropped on a marble floor. A chambermaid claimed she had once been sent to deliver a sealed letter to the queen, only to be stopped at the door by the younger prince himself. She never saw the letter again. A royal scribe admitted, in a moment of too much wine, that he had been ordered months earlier to destroy certain pages from the court calendar, pages that detailed the private engagements of the royal family. A huntsman swore he had witnessed the queen and the prince in the forest during a royal hunt, their horses standing still while the rest of the party rode on ahead. He did not hear their words, but he saw the way her gloved hand rested on his arm, as if it belonged there. Individually, these stories could be dismissed as gossip, misremembered moments, or the fabrications of servants hoping to curry favor with the faction opposed to the king's marriage. But together, they formed something harder to ignore, a suggestion that the line between family and lover had blurred long before the crown changed hands. The queen, for her part, offered no public defense. Her silence was both her shield and her most dangerous weapon. No admission, no denial, only a gaze that lingered too long when it met the king's, a half-smile that could be read as either affection or triumph. Then came the discovery in the royal archives, a bundle of unsent letters written in the king's own hand before his coronation. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, speaking of a bond forged beyond duty and a promise made in shadows, awaiting the day it could be fulfilled. The letters bore no names, but to those who had already drawn their conclusions, none were needed. By the time these whispers reached the ears of the church's envoy, they had taken on the weight of truth, whether or not they were true at all. And in a court where perception could topple a reign faster than any army, truth was only one piece of the puzzle. The marriage had secured the throne, for now, but it had also lit a fuse, and everyone in the palace could feel the heat, creeping closer to the powder. The moment came, not with a sword drawn or a proclamation read aloud, but in the stillness of a room, heavy with incense and judgment. The church's envoy had summoned the king and queen to a private audience in the chapel, a place meant for prayer, but that morning it felt more like a court of trial. Sunlight spilled through stained glass, painting their faces in fractured reds and golds, as if even the light itself could not see them clearly. The envoy's words were measured, each one a pebble dropped into deep water. There was talk of scandal, perceived by the faithful, of whispers that could erode the sanctity of the crown. He did not accuse outright. He didn't need to. The weight of implication was enough. The king listened in silence, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming once against the armrest of his chair. The queen stood beside him, her head inclined, her veil drawn low. When the envoy finally fell quiet, the king rose, not to defend himself, but to dismiss the meeting. From that day, the isolation began. Invitations from foreign courts ceased. A planned treaty was quietly withdrawn. Even within the palace, certain nobles found reasons not to attend council. It was as if the marriage had drawn a line across the kingdom, and everyone was forced to choose a side. The breaking point came during the feast of St. Aurelius, a celebration that should have unified the court. Midway through the banquet, a group of high-ranking lords stood, bowed stiffly to the king, and left the hall without explanation. The music faltered. Conversations died. The absence was louder than any open defiance. In the weeks that followed, the king's temper grew short. Edicts were issued to silence malicious speech against the crown. Punishments fell on those accused of spreading rumors. But no decree could stop what spread in the shadows, stories of the queen's long-standing affection for her late husband's brother, of glances exchanged years before the coronation. The queen endured the storm with her same unyielding composure. Yet those who served her closely noticed the change, the long hours alone in the royal gardens, the way her hands lingered on the windowsill as she watched the city below, perhaps wondering if the people were speaking her name in praise or in condemnation. The final blow was not a coup, nor an uprising. It was a winter illness that struck the king without warning. For weeks, he battled fever while the court held its breath. The queen never left his side, but the rumors did not stop. Some even claimed her constant presence was not out of love, but out of fear of what he might say in delirium. When the fever broke, the king emerged thinner, grayer, but alive. Still, something in him had shifted. He attended fewer public audiences. He trusted fewer voices. The man who had once moved through the court with ease now seemed to see enemies in every shadow. The marriage had preserved the crown, but at a cost neither of them could have foreseen. Power was theirs, yes, but so was the burden of a story the world had already decided how to tell. And so the kingdom moved forward, the throne occupied, the laws obeyed. But in the quiet corners of the palace, where candlelight flickered on cold stone, the unspoken question still lingered, as sharp and unrelenting as it had been on their wedding day. Since when? Centuries have passed since that summer when a king married his brother's widow, yet the echoes of their choice still resonate. History has a way of preserving certain stories, not because they were the most violent or the most tragic, but because they challenged the boundaries of what was acceptable in their time. At its core, this is not simply a tale of royalty. It is about the collision of two forces that rarely coexist in harmony: power and intimacy. In the public eye, love can never be private, and in the corridors of power, private decisions can never truly belong to the individuals who make them. In their world, marriage was a political instrument designed to seal alliances, secure borders, and produce heirs. But the heart does not negotiate treaties. When affection or desire slips into that arena, it disrupts the careful balance of duty and appearance. For some, this disruption is seen as betrayal. For others, it is an assertion of humanity in a system that allows little room for it. We might like to think we have moved beyond such constraints. Today, monarchies, where they still exist, are largely ceremonial. Leaders, in most parts of the world, are free to marry for love rather than politics. And yet scandals still erupt when those in positions of influence make personal choices that defy public expectation. The same forces that fueled whispers in palace corridors now thrive on headlines, social media threads, and viral speculation. The question, "Since when?" once whispered over goblets of wine in candlelit halls, is now typed in comment sections, broadcast in podcasts, debated by strangers who will never meet the people they discuss. The appetite for narratives that blend power with forbidden affection has not diminished. It has simply changed its stage. Perhaps the lesson is not whether such unions should or should not happen, but in how we respond to them. Every generation redefines the limits of propriety, yet those who cross them, whether in the 14th century or the 21st, are inevitably remembered as symbols of defiance or cautionary tales, depending on who tells the story. And so we return to that moment, frozen in the minds of those who witnessed it: a king, a queen, a crown, and a vow. Was it love disguised as duty, or duty softened by love? We will never know for certain, but history rarely offers certainty, only the fragments of human choice, left for us to interpret. The great hall is empty now. The banners from the wedding have faded, their once bright threads dulled by time and dust. On the throne rests the crown, silent, waiting, while on the table beside it, two wedding rings lie side by side. They are simple bands of gold, their surfaces worn smooth, as if the years have been rubbing away the edges of their story. Outside, the city has long since moved on. New rulers have come, new alliances have been forged, and yet this chapter remains, tucked between the lines of history like a pressed flower, its colors muted, but its shape still intact. Some see it as a love story, others as a political maneuver. Perhaps it was both, perhaps it was neither. But one truth endures. The choices made in the shadows of power rarely stay there forever. They surface again and again, reshaped by the mouths that retell them. What do you think? Was this the union of two hearts, or the sealing of a crown's survival? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to hear more of the histories the world tried to forget, subscribe and join us for the next story.